All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. It's July 15th, 2015. We're here with Craig Singletary, and we're talking about Craig's Linfield career. And our first question, which we always like to ask, is why Linfield?
Well, that's interesting because I never intended to go into education when I started out, because as a little kid I was always entranced with broadcasting. In fact, my mother used to say that when the dogs next door got into a fight and so forth, I would pick up a broom handle and start to announce what was going on. Anyway, when in high school at Grant High School in Portland, of course they had their public school broadcasting station, KBPS, and so they had auditions for sportscasters and that sort of thing. And so I tried out, and my senior year I was selected to be the color announcer for the high school football games. And then during the baseball season, I actually did some play-by-play as well. And so that really got me, my interest peaked in terms of doing broadcasting. And then I went to Lewis and Clark, and halfway, at the beginning of the sophomore year, a bunch of us decided to join the Oregon Air National Guard. And because the Korean War had broken out, unfortunately, toward the end of my sophomore year, we were called up into federal duty, and I wound up in the Air Force up in Fairbanks, Alaska. And I wasn't too excited about being in aircraft control and warning and drawing little figures on a plastic sheet. And so I transferred over to Air Base Group and auditioned for Armed Forces radio station on the base, and got a position there, which I carried on for about 16 years. I did everything in the book, you know, disc jockey and board operator, and did the sports broadcasts as well. And then I came back, finished Lewis and Clark about a year after my graduating class in '54. And so then a friend of mine said, who lived in Mcminnville, said, they've got an opening at the radio station at KMCM, and so would you be interested? And I said, well, sure. So I came down, had coffee with the manager at a coffee shop in Mcminnville, and I was so surprised when he didn't ask me to come out to the radio station for an audition. And he said, when can you start work? And I said, okay, anytime. So that's kind of how I got started in the radio business. Of course, the nice thing about coming to Linfield, then I was able to keep one foot in broadcasting and one foot in education, because I really enjoyed being around the kids.
So, as we understand it, you were hired first at Linfield to broadcast sporting events and moved into teaching after that, is that correct?
Oh, no, let's see what happened. Oh, yeah, at KMCM, my first fall season there, I started doing broadcasts of the Mcminnville High School football and then basketball in the spring. And it was either the following year or 2 years after we started that we started doing Linfield broadcast football games. And the interesting thing about that was the fact that we were just coming out of a depression in Mcminnville. We'd lost 2 lumber mills, and boy, there wasn't much in the way of advertising revenue to support any kind of broadcasting, but fortunately Dave Davidson at Davidson Auto Parts has stepped in along with others. And as I say, I can't remember whether it was the following year or 2 years later in 56 or 57 that we started doing Linfield football games. And of course those were night games because we had a lighted field then. Mm-hmm. And then we started doing basketball games as well. So, you know, it's kind of interesting because Brad Thompson, the chairman of the mass comm department here at Linfield, said that, you know, you've been here since the start of the Linfield football streak. And I thought, my gosh, he's right. because I was either doing on-the-air broadcast or doing the PA system. And, you know, and people often ask me, well, how come you stuck with it so long? Look, when you've got a winning season, who wants to give that up?
Right. You can't walk away. You might be the jinx.
Exactly. Yeah.
So then how did you get into teaching here?
Oh, okay. In 1958, Roy Mahaffey, who was the chairman of the speech department, came to me one day and said, would you be interested in teaching a couple of classes on a part-time basis in addition to your radio job? And I could get clear in the afternoon because I was doing a morning show and so forth and so on. And so I said, yeah, what did you have in mind? He said, well, we do have some radio activity and doing some Linfield things through KMCM. So would you be available to come out and maybe do a kind of an introductory class to radio broadcasting? And I said, sure, I could do that. And he said, and we have a section of public speaking available, because if I remember correctly, practically every student on campus had to take a course in public speaking. And so we had to have 7 or 8 sections of public speaking available. And so I said, sure, I could do that. And after 2 years then, he came back to me and said, would you be interested in joining the faculty full time? And I thought, oh my goodness, you know, that's not a bad idea, because radio at that time, and it always has been, kind of a revolving door, you know. There's no sense of job security because your whole thing is based on program ratings and so forth. And I thought, gosh, if I want to have a steady family life and so forth, this is a golden opportunity for me. So I said yes, I would like to do that. And so in the fall of 1960, I became a full-time member of the faculty. However, I was probably, and I'm only guessing at this, but I would say that I may have been just among a handful of people ever hired full-time to the faculty without a graduate degree. And so a month or two later, Wynn Dolan, who was the acting faculty dean at that time, called me into his office and he said, you know, Craig, you're going to have to be thinking about picking up a graduate degree. And I said, I know, and I've been thinking about that, and I fully intend to do that. So the following summer, I enrolled at the University of Oregon in their speech department. And so for the next 3 summers of summer school and some reading and conference during the academic year down there, I finally got the master's degree in, I believe it was 1965, but my emphasis was in radio and television, obviously, my first love, so that worked out fine. And then I began to realize that, you know, Mahaffey's going to retire probably in 1970, and if I want to move up in the academic hierarchy, I'm going to have to think about going after the PhD. So in 1966, I asked Harry Dillon, the president at the time, for a year's leave of absence, which he granted me. And I was all set to go back to University of Oregon. But this time, rather than radio television, I decided that in a small college, you have to be a generalist, really, because of its size. And so I decided that I'm going to get it in rhetoric and public address to broaden my understanding of the whole area of speech. And so that's what I did. However, when you have 4 young daughters at home, you begin to wonder, how am I going to pay for all this? And so what happened was, out of the blue, I get a call from the speech department at Oregon saying they had a National Defense Scholarship loan available, and did I want to take it because the person who had it only decided to use it for a year, and that made all the difference in the world, because that meant that I didn't have to be a TA for as many sections, and that I could take more hours in my major and get a stipend to also. So, of course, my wife went to work as a telephone operator anyway. Fortunately, I had a mother-in-law who was in town who could kind of take care of the kids. So, so that came through, and that really helped immensely. And so, 2.5 years later, in August of '68, I got the PhD in Rhetoric and Public Address, returned to Linfield, and here we are.
Almost like an accidental academic, like it kind of happened for you.
Yeah, doors continue to open. I was really quite fortunate. So, and I only had to spend, I had rented a room with my wife's relatives down in Eugene, so I would stay down there Monday through Friday and drive home on the weekends and that sort of thing. And I only had to spend about 1.5 years on campus, because the rest of the time was doing research on the dissertation and writing it, which I could do at home. So, yeah.
So you've been at Linfield you worked here with four full presidents, as well as 2 acting presidents. You were hired under Dillon and President Bjork and Walker and Bull and Wynne-Dolan and Simmons. Talk to me a little bit about memories of the different presidents.
Harry was interesting because he was a builder, for one thing. You know, a lot of these buildings were constructed under his administration, and he had a funny way of coming into faculty meetings and say, all right, we can spend our money on this project, or we can put more biscuits on the table, meaning we could raise your salaries and so forth. So I always found that amusing. But Harry had pretty tight control over everything, and I didn't have a problem with that. Whenever I was in faculty meetings as a young faculty member, I always listened to what Wynne-Dolan would have to say, and generally I'd follow his directions and thinking. So anyway, yeah, I always enjoyed Harry. He was interesting because Harry was a member of the Rotary Club, and I was too, and it was always interesting because on campus, he had one personality, but when we were at Rotary conventions and gatherings, he was a completely different person, you know, very alive and outgoing and so forth and so on. So I saw both sides of him. Following Harry, we had Cornelius Siemens, who was a past president at Humboldt State in California. And, oh, wait a minute. No, that was after Gordon Bjork. Right. Gordon Bjork came in, and Gordon was fairly young and had never been in that position before, and met a little opposition. But one thing I admired him for was to institute a plan of no-need scholarships for gifted students. And believe me, after about a year, I saw a significant change in the kinds of students that were coming into my classes. Really a remarkable difference. So it worked, but it plunged the college a little further into debt, obviously. And then it reached the point where there was a vote of no confidence in the faculty. I'm not sure that I was on the bandwagon on that side of the issue, because you know, he was doing what he felt was best, but it turned out apparently it wasn't. That's when Cornelius Siemens came in, and Siemens did a very made a difficult decision in that he trimmed the faculty salaries by 5%, and as a result of that, it's surprising the number of faculty wives that went into business for themselves or went to work, including my wife, who opened a dress shop downtown. And I remember Paul Howard's wife opened a travel bureau just to provide income to make up for that missing 5%. But anyway, he really got the college budget back in balance, and that was very important because those were critical times for the college. And then following him, Charlie Walker came on, and that was the first president in my experience here that had been helped selected by a broad committee of students and faculty and graduates and so forth. We'd never had that before because with Harry, he was pretty much selecting what he thought were the appropriate candidates and brought them in. And we didn't have much input into who it was except for the Board of Trustees. So consequently, when Charlie came on, we were able to have faculty meetings with him, and he met with students and had meals in the Commons with them. But I remember one thing that stood out in my mind. Somebody asked him about his fundraising ability, and he said, "I've really had very little experience in that. So this will be something a bit new for me." And I thought, uh-oh, we may have some problems here because the college president has to be the chief fundraiser. And, but as time went on, Charlie had this laid-back attitude, and you never felt like he was pitching something or making a hard sell. He'd just kind of sneak up on you with a request for something. And he became one of the best fundraisers, I think, among all the presidents we've had. And it was just amazing how quickly he learned. And I remember one of his first public speeches was put a bounce in your step and this sort of thing, and I thought, oh my. Anyway, Charlie was one of my favorites. He was a good administrator, he listened to people, and I'm still close friends with him today. So, and then we had Vivian Bull come in, and for our first woman candidate, and I thought, oh, well, this is going to be different, because I don't think very many colleges had women presidents. But by golly, she surprised us. Well, my wife had the job of kind of escorting her around on her first visit to Linfield. And here she showed up in tennis shoes and casually dressed. She looked almost like a nun. And but you know, she handled that whole situation with Hewlett-Packard to get that land, make a deal to purchase the buildings, got the land donated. And I thought, wow, she knows her stuff. Well, on the board were some very well-educated financial people, which obviously gave her help along the way. But I thought, boy, that was a dramatic step for her to make. And my goodness, increased the size of the campus by a healthy margin. So anyway, I have kind regards for her as well. So we have Tom Helly today, and it was kind of interesting. They had to go through 2 different searches to find him, but I think Tom's doing a good job, so I feel pretty confident about the leadership.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, going back to what you're talking about with Harry Dillon and his personality on campus versus his personality at the Rotary Club. Do you have a thoughts on why that was, why he was such a different personality?
Well, I think perhaps he had to maintain kind of a a leader, an academic leader persona on campus, and maintained pretty much of a straight line. When he got out among the Rotarians, these were just friends of his that he could share easily with, and consequently, he could really be himself. Because privately, you know, he was a very amiable person. And so, yeah, that may have been the difference.
So you were hired right at the start of the 1960s, and you stayed on campus. I'm still on campus today, but you've been on campus for a lot of change in the world, change in the Northwest. Talk about the kind of the campus changes you've noticed since you started here.
That's, yeah, I hadn't really thought much about that, but I think there's probably been more of a liberalizing influence over the last 20, 25 years, more open to students that have a little different way of looking at the world and in terms of behavior and that sort of thing. Yeah, wish I could be more specific rather than so general about it. Because, you know, I really haven't been on campus since '93, so I can't believe that I've been retired for over 20 years or whatever it is. So I really haven't been that close to campus except for the athletic events and so forth and so on, yeah.
Was there something noticeable about students in the 60s versus students in the 90s? Was there a large difference, or have Linfield students kind of always been Linfield students?
Well, yeah, I think maybe there's kind of an ethos about students that to a large extent come from small high schools, small communities, maybe the first in their families to go to college, and I'm proud to say that I have 4 daughters, and the daughter of my youngest daughter just graduated from Linfield, and in mathematics and education, and got a job right away over at West Salem Middle School teaching math starting in the fall. And her brother is entering Linfield in the fall, and he wants to be on the football team. He's a Metro League All-Star player. And in fact, his stepbrother will be a sophomore at Linfield this year, so we're developing quite a crew of family coming through.
It's been one of my favorite things about being here is all the generations that keep the legacies that show up on campus.
Well, let me tell you something, Rich, that I remember way back when in the 60s, Mike Spellman was a student in a couple of my classes, and Mike was also on the football team, an excellent student. When his daughter showed up in one of my classes 20 years later, I thought, my goodness, it's time to retire. My goodness, I've been here too long. Yeah.
So, where did you get the idea for starting the campus radio station, and how did that get off the ground?
Well, good question, because under Roy Mahaffey, they'd done some radio things through KMCM from Linfield, and but not very much. And of course I thought, you know, if these students are going to gain some practical experience and want to go into broadcasting eventually, then obviously they're going to have to get some background. So one of the early things, I think the second year I was here, was to put together what is called a carrier current radio station, where you don't have a transmitter, but you feed the signal back through power lines and use the power lines around campus to be your campus antenna. The only problem with that is every time that signal met a transformer, it got blocked. So the coverage on campus was very limited, but at least the students felt that they had something to play with. And I think I was able to pick up an old audio board from KMCM that they donated to us, a couple of turntables, and so they had the basic equipment, and we bought a couple of microphones, and so they were mainly on the air from, I don't know, 7 o'clock in the evening till 10 or 11 at night. But they felt good because they were sitting in front of a microphone and spinning records and doing all this neat stuff, and occasionally somebody would say, "Oh, I heard you on the radio last night." And so we continued to do that for the next several years. In the meantime, the owner-manager of KMCM was giving the college kind of a bad time through on-air editorials about shopping out of town for college supplies and stuff and so forth. And it got to the point where the Board of Trustees finally said, "Look, this guy keeps pecking at us about these things, and can't we do something?" And so they authorized me to go ahead and file for a low-power educational FM channel. And eventually we got the grant from the FCC and went on the air, and I forget, probably it was only about 10 watts of power, but at least we weren't blocked by the transformers, and we could cover most of McMinnville. So that's how we did it, and went on the air, and of course more students got involved in it. And eventually we were on the air during the days and evenings and that sort of thing, and weekends. But we certainly didn't have what they have over there now, program automation and all this neat stuff. And we gave the students experience in doing sports broadcasting. So we had a broadcast crew for football, a separate one for basketball, another one for girls volleyball and girls basketball. And so we got a lot of kids involved, and a lot of them went on to positions in, you know, I look back, and Steve Arena, who eventually became sports director at Channel 2 in Portland, they even hired him right out of his internship there before he graduated. And he said, "Look, I want to finish school and then I'll do that." And Gary Walker, who became the news director at Channel 2 for a period of time, was a Linfield grad, and a bunch of others that I won't bother going into. So,
how involved were you once it was launched? How involved were you day to day, week to week with it? Were you still keeping? Was it mostly student run, or were you pretty involved?
It was mainly student run, and I remember the night we went on with our inaugural broadcast, and I thought, this is going to be a grand occasion. We'll do certain things to announce that we're on, but I'll kind of leave it up to the students as to what they want to do. And one of the first music pieces they played was something, I think, by Three Dog Night or something, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is not the right kind of academic atmosphere I want to create through this radio station. But eventually, in the evenings, we did a 1-hour classical music program, and I selected the music and pre-recorded the intros for the tunes, so they didn't have to bumble their way through any odd pronunciations and that sort of thing. I really wanted to have a radio station with class. But since the students were running it, and you got to keep their interest up, I pretty much let them handle programming and so forth. But it was a good experience, and a lot of them appreciated the responsibility put in their hands. In fact, I think Gary became the station manager as a sophomore, and he went on to really do an excellent job on local news coverage and so forth that we never had before.
And I understand you also created some sort of TV program for televising football games. Is that right?
Oh yeah, yeah. That was interesting because we worked through Comcast because we used their field equipment, and so on Saturdays we'd have to reserve a parking spot out there to put their van, and because the video and audio controls were down in the van and haul cables up over the roof of the press box and in, and so yeah, let's see, I think we were using at least 2 cameras, one on about the 35-yard line at each end of the, we had one down in the field as well, and boy, and the students entirely directed it and did all the camera work.
Wow.
And they learned a lot. One of them was Peter Clem. Now, Peter, when he graduated from Linfield, did an internship at Channel 2, and then he went back to Minneapolis, I think, and worked in a TV station there. From there, he saw an opening on the Oprah Winfrey Show crew, and he applied, and he said, you know, probably the one mistake I made was seeing an assistant producer and an associate producer. So obviously I went for the associate because that was a higher rank. He said that's the one big mistake I made, because he said, for a whole year there, I was working 60 hours a week. I had to present 100 program ideas to Oprah to even get on board. And then he said, it was just a madhouse. He said, if I'd taken the assistant, it would have been much easier. But anyway, he stuck it out for about a year, and then decided to move out of there, and he joined HGTV down in Knoxville, and he was producing several of their programs, including their live coverage of the Rose Festival Parade from, the Tournament of Roses from Pasadena. And in fact, he asked me if I ever wanted to come over to attend, why he'd arrange the tickets and all that, but getting accommodations and that was out of the question. So anyway, and he's still with HGTV in pretty much in an executive position. So he's one that did very well from that sports video. And yeah, we play the tapes back on Monday evening, and for a while I think even the cable station in Salem was playing them too. Yeah.
So speaking of the covering football and basketball games, are there any memorable games that stand out in your mind? Any memorable wins or losses?
Oh gosh.
It's a loaded question.
See, no, I remember that so clearly, and I'm trying to think. It was I think, an NAIA playoff game here against Central of Iowa. And Central, well, I'm a little foggy on the details, but it seems to me that coming up to the last play of the game, they were about 2 points behind. And so they elected to go for a field goal. Well, the kick was low and apparently bounced off the back of one of their linemen, and it was picked up by maybe the holder or the kicker, and he took off to his left and ran around the Linfield team and in for a touchdown. That was the game, because everybody in the stands thought, well, it was a missed field goal, it's a dead ball.
Right.
it's still a live ball. And the Linfield kids didn't realize that. And when they found out, there was such gloom in the stadium. Because everybody in the press box and in the grandstands were yelling and celebrating. Suddenly they'd lost the ball game. And as a consequence, that was the only time I went dead in the water. I couldn't say a thing. I think all I said was the final score is such and such, and I just shut my mouth because I was so disappointed. I couldn't say a thing further. Yeah. But I think one of the big ones was down in Sul Ross, Texas, in Midland, Texas, against Sul Ross State, again an NAIA playoff game, when Tim Kubley kicked a field goal in the final seconds of the game to win it for us. That was one of the exciting highlights of my broadcasting career, because I think that year I was able to travel with the team to Fargo, North Dakota to play Concordia. The interesting thing about that was the split end for Concordia was Ed Langsdorf, who eventually became a coach here at Linfield. And the other thing is kind of interesting. Because we were a low-budget operation at the radio station, they could only afford to send me back there to Concordia. The day of the game, it was probably only 15 or 20 degrees outside. The sun was shining brightly, but they did have little furnaces down there to help the guys keep warm. But they all had to go out and buy long underwear before the game. And so at halftime, the sun was shining brightly into the press box. I had only had arranged one interviewee, probably Harry Dillon, to come in. Well, suddenly all these game executives started coming in because they wanted to get warm. I mean, we were sitting there in shirt sleeves in the press box with that sun coming in. And so I wound up not only interviewing Harry, I think I interviewed the president of Concordia and an executive from NAIA, and I think even the governor of Minnesota, I don't know who. I had 5 or 6 people all lined up. No sweat.
It's nice when the fish just jump in the boat for you, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Do you tend to find, you've seen many games over the years. Do you tend to find that the losses are easier to remember than the wins? Do they stick more in your brain than the wins?
Yeah, probably, because they were disappointments, but really not too much, because we were able to make it a winning season. And that's another thing that I think is so important to kids playing football today. They don't want to be on the team that breaks that streak.
Sure.
And believe me, they play with gusto and enthusiasm and commitment that otherwise kids probably wouldn't have. And that's really amazing, But all of these kids, I've discovered that among the best students in many of my classes were the athletes involved, because they had to be disciplined and use their schedules wisely, and be able to prioritize their studies and everything. And a lot of them went on to achieve great things.
To change gears a little bit, how did you become involved in forensics here?
That's interesting, because at Lewis and Clark, I think I only entered maybe 2 or 3 speech events, because I was so busy cramming classes in to get out of there only 1 year after my graduating class. And so I remember entering interpretive reading and radio speaking and something else, I forget what it was. But I did come down to the Linfield tournament my senior year and entered an event called radio speaking, and did my 3 rounds and final rounds and so forth. Went back home to Portland and discovered later that I'd won the event. And so that was kind of fun. Anyway, HAP was one of the nation's premier tournament founders and administrators, because I think at one time, maybe we still are, the oldest continuous college tournament in the country, even during the Second World War. And so I just sat at HAP's feet beginning in 1960 as an assistant on the squad, and picked up everything I learned from him. And he was very good at what he did. But you know, running that tournament, my gosh, there were times when we had more high school students on campus participating than we had students enrolled at Linfield. And where do we place them? My goodness, we had them in the large restrooms down in Pioneer. We had them in school buses. We had them every conceivable space. It was very difficult. In fact, for a while, we even had kids bringing sleeping bags and sleeping in the old gym, in the upper gym and so forth, because they ran out of motel rooms here in town. So, yeah, and so when I finally came on board in 1970, I thought, I'm going to have to cut back the size of this tournament somehow. And so we did get it into more manageable situations. But we ran the high school tournament one weekend, and then decided 2 weeks later to have the college tournament come in, because we were already set up for tournaments. We might as well get them over with in a short period of time. So we did, and we drew a lot of colleges here, 35, 40 colleges at our tournaments as well. Yeah. Yeah.
So beyond the accommodations, what were the other logistical problems you had to deal with that many people? How did you find so many judges? How did you find rooms?
For the high school kids in the junior events, we used a lot of our college students who were on the speech squad and so forth. And we invited people from the community to come in and help judge who'd had some experience. And I think the League of Women Voters helped us occasionally, that sort of thing. For the college tournament, it wasn't quite as difficult, because we would use all of the coaches plus any extra people that had judged previously. So at least they got a higher quality of judging. But yeah, that was always a constant problem. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So in the late 80s and early 90s, you conducted a series of interviews similar to this one with some recently retired Linfield luminaries.
Right.
How did that project get started? Was that your idea?
Yeah, I thought that, you know, there ought to be some record seeing and hearing these people talk about their time at Linfield, how they wound up at Linfield, and some of the same questions you're posing with me. And I found Harry Dillon's particularly illuminating, because you know, he was here during the formative stages of the college. I mean, he came here really as a young tennis coach, and but he was a builder, and he knew his way around, yeah. So, and of course there were conflicts that came up and differences of opinion, and he was quite open about sharing that with me, and I thought it was really a fascinating interview.
And you also interviewed the Coach Durham and Coach Helzer.
Oh yeah, that was fun, because I think I had interviewed them maybe separately and then together, And of course, when you get two athletic coaches together, they tell all kinds of war stories and funny things about various players and teams and travel experience. And of course, Paul Durham had written this column for the News Register and came up with this fictional character called Uni Gagan. And Paul had a unique sense of humor anyway. Yeah, I really appreciated both those guys. They were something else. You know, one of the things I appreciated about the athletic department was the quality and character of the coaches we've had on staff here. My goodness sakes, it's just really amazing at how well they deal with students, you know, Ed Rutschman and all the rest of them, because their primary interest is in educating kids, creating characters that will last them throughout their lifetime, and it's just an excellent educational experience for them.
I think we saw that last year with Coach Smith and the football team having to handle the tragedy last year.
Exactly.
How well he handled that.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that you were in Rotary and a couple other McMinnville organizations. How did those come about? Was that something that interested you, or were you invited along?
Let's see, I came on board in, it must have been I forget when, mid-1960s. My friend who invited me to come down in the first place to McMinnville was a Rotarian, and he asked if I'd be interested in joining, and I thought, well, my goodness, you know, here I am, just a newcomer. And most of the people in Rotary are owners or managers of businesses, you know. These are the political and civic leaders of the community. How do I fit in with them? But at any rate, I did the noon news at KMCM from 12 to 12:15, and somebody suggested, why don't you come down after you read the newscast and give us maybe a 4 or 5 minute summary of the news that you've read out there and give it to the Rotary Club. So I did that for I don't know how long, a fairly lengthy period of time, and then I was asked to join the club, and I did. The strange thing was that I forget how long I'd been in the club, not very long, but I got elected to the board of directors maybe in 3 or 4 years later, and the fellow who was next in line to become president, who was Ron Eberall, the head of Sunshine Dairy, he decided he didn't want the job. And so then I guess maybe nobody else in the board wanted it either, but I was naive enough to, when they asked me, to say, okay. So I probably was the youngest president of Rotary. I think I was only about 28 or 29 years old at the time. So that was a challenge. But it was an enjoyable experience, and we did some interesting things, including I had put together an auction of gifts from foreign Rotary clubs. I wrote letters all over the world, and they sent gifts in, and we had an auction one night.
Oh, that's really cool.
And that was really a popular money-raising thing for us.
So what other duties do you have as a Rotary president? That sounds like a lot on your plate.
Well, generally to arrange program speakers every Friday and conduct board meetings and that sort of thing. So, yeah, that was probably the main thing. Yeah.
So along those lines, something we always like to ask long-term McMinnville residents about is the connection between McMinnville and Linfield. The kind of town and gown connection. What have you noticed about that in your time here?
Oh, I think it's been excellent. yearly fundraising drive has gone very well, and in fact, my first wife, who is deceased, was one of the was the chairman of that. What's the name of the campaign? I can't think of it at the moment, but the fundraising town and gown thing. She tried to consolidate the campaign, so we would have advanced gifts early on, and then make the campaign fairly short and sweet, and I think met their goal with no problem. But yeah, in fact, I was one of the campaign workers that went out and made contacts and raised money, and so I think the relationship has been very good, because so many Linfield people are involved in community activities, you know, whether it's building houses for the less fortunate and things of that sort. They're involved in church activities, and so there's a very close connection between town and gown.
Where do you see Linfield going in the future, or where would you like it to go?
You know, that's interesting. I'm sure there are some people who feel that we ought to be becoming the Whitman College of the West and that sort of thing. But I think that the present movement is probably correct in bringing in a lot of students who are first-time college enrollees from families, and providing the kind of financial aid that allow them to do that. So yeah, I hadn't given much thought to that question, but I think you can rise too far in achieving an academic greatness that you kind of cut some students out of the process.
Okay. Is there anything we've forgotten to ask you about that you'd like to tell us, like to talk about?
Gosh, I think we've covered the world and everything in it, but no, I can't think of anything else, Rich. So
I'll ask you one last question then.
Okay.
What advice do you have for today's students?
You know, one of the things that kind of bothers me when I look around, I mean, this applies not only to students and adults, but sometimes when I'm in groups, social groups of people, and I see one or two people that always have their nose poked into an iPhone, punching up stuff, and I don't know what they're doing, whether they're getting information or tweeting somebody else. I think, come on, folks, you're part of a group. Let's have some interaction, and let's hear what you're thinking about things. And so that scares me a little bit about the present group of students, that you become so tied up to an electronic gadget that you miss out on the social interaction that is so promising and fruitful to people in terms of their own advancement. And so I guess that's one of the worries that I have.
That seems a fair point.
Yeah.
All right, then.
Ask him to do his sign off.
Oh, I'm supposed to ask you to do your sign off, to sign us off from our interview today.
Oh gosh, I don't know what that is.
When you're on the radio, did you have a sign off like, you know, and this is Craig Singletary from KSLC?
Oh, this is Craig Singletary speaking to you from KSLC in Mcminnville.
Perfect, thank you.